know what you're all thinking. That libertarian standing up there, that autonomy means something like this, right? I promise you it doesn't mean that. Autonomy means more the physician being able to ration out care as he sees fit in an instance like this. Those medvac people being able to say, we want to go get this person, we're going to take the risk, we can. Now there's pushback in my argument. It's a great idea, but Dr. Clayton says, can that really work? Because imperfection is a reality. And what does this mean? This means that imagine for a second that I'm a general and a third of you are physicians, and we're carrying out combat operations, and I say attack. And the physicians say, no, we're going to take too many casualties. And we take casualties and the physicians are not going to move. They're going to treat them there. Guess what happens? The Army's motto, to preserve the fighting force, there's no more fighting force. Combat operations go so terribly, no one makes it out in this situation. So really, what do you do? I'm left at this fundamental point still to this day. The best thing I could conclude in my paper was that the prescription's discernment. And in a Jesuit institution, discernment ought to trigger some minds. What does discernment mean? Discernment means that I struggle with this. I cannot do this. I cannot be complicit in this. But the only reason that I'm here is because somebody, somewhere along the line, stabilized my grandfather and was. So my final move in my paper reads a little something like, I cannot justify the military medical system. I can't be in it. But I also can't justify war. There are such things as necessary wars, but I'm still struggling if there's a just war. So how can you expect to have an ethical, dual mixed agency system in an unethical situation to begin from? And so I'm still working on it. The one thing I can say is that I did not waste my time. If we don't do research like this, if we don't look at issues like this, what happens? Specialist Clark goes unreported. How many people knew about Specialist Clark before this happened? Junior seminar? It was a fairly large story, but at the same time, it's a blip in what happens. And we cannot settle for that 8% casualty rate, that 2% casualty rate in these. We have to work to make the system, as utilitarian as it is, flexible to the specific needs and contingencies that arise. So thank you very much. I also want to quickly re-acknowledge everyone who I acknowledged before, and then say it's time for the most dreaded portion.
And we will have just a few questions. We'll invite our thesis advisor, Dr. Franco, to ask a question or two. Dr. Clayton, I might have one, and then we'll open it to anyone else who has one.
We talked a little bit about that, but Matthew 6:24 says you cannot serve two masters.
Man can serve two masters.
So you address that the role of the physician as a healer in a military environment. In your particular case, you're going to be a civilian physician, and so you're going to be a healer, but you're also most likely going to be an employee in a big hospital. And so how are you going, and conflicts are going to arise, how are you going to resolve these kind of conflicts that are going to arise?
Well, I'll start by saying that in my entire life so far, I haven't been afraid of a little conflict. In fact, sometimes I enjoy it. And so I will say that having done this thesis, I absolutely know what I can do and what decisions I can't make. And I honestly believe that at some point we have to take it on faith that if we act justly, we may get slowed down in a system that is by itself unjust, but eventually you have to be able to live with the decision that you make, right? And so I'm sure I'll run into resistance. I'm sure I'll run into insurance snafus, and maybe I'll pull a Dr. Cox's throat and get a person who just passed away's insurance to cover a quick move. I don't see the problem with fudging things as long as you stay true to the patient who you've said you're going to give 120%, all your effort, everything you have, to see them through as best you can. I hope that begins to cover it.
So you're called before a congressional committee.
Yes, sir.
You're a doctor. You're a very prominent doctor, and I have no doubt you're going to be a very prominent doctor. And you're asked to make recommendations with regard to this particular kind of situation, this dilemma. So you have to get off that fence.
Yes, sir.
The turn is really nice. I like it at the end. I really do. So I understand your own personal dilemma here. But you're going to be asked to give recommendations. What would you recommend?
Recommendations for the system, or
Yeah,
positions
for the
to go
system.
into it?
For the system. If this system has these kinds of problems inherent in it, what would you recommend?
For those,
Go ahead.
for those of you who don't know, Dr. Clayton has been telling me to get off the fence in pretty much every paper I've ever written. So this is nothing too unexpected. What I'll say is, when I look deeper and deeper into it, the only way that I can see remodeling the system, I could say, let's be more like the French, and that would not go over well. So what we sorry, Marie Dominique Franco. What I can say is that the best recommendation I could give is that perhaps the people we put in charge of our field battalions, our aid stations, maybe they're not just simple corpsmen, they're those who pull somewhat of a higher rank, so that not as many people have the ability to weigh in on the decision. Now, the complicating factor to this is that my solution is placing somebody more deeply into the problem, correct? But perhaps somebody with a similar sort of ethical stance, a patient-first sort of stance, higher up in the system, who's aware of combat operations, will be able to more effectively make these sorts of decisions that aren't going to endanger the whole unit to catastrophe, but are going to account for situations like Specialist Chancellor Clark's, where they say go. That's the only concrete answer I have at this time. I'm still working.
Is it my turn?
I think it's
And then near the end, you slip into conversation with one of my favorite authors, and you're sort of quoting some of her sources, and you're talking about redeeming the world just as it is. Right?
Yes, she makes an entrance.
Yeah, and so I guess I'm interested, Jeff, in you work really